You're listening to Law, Life, and Culture with Betsy Kim on WNHH LP 103.5 FM.
The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted how affordable housing is a basic need and a public health concern. Especially if people need to shelter in place, there must be affordable, secure housing. I think most Americans would agree that all people should have basic, clean, safe, decent housing in livable neighborhoods. How can community and economic development help in getting us there as a society? Can there be neighborhood revitalization that preserves neighborhoods and doesn't price out long-term residents? Today, our guest, Anika Singh Lamar, an associate professor at Yale Law School, will tackle these questions and more. She teaches the law school's Community and Economic Development Clinic and is also a commissioner for affordable housing in the city of New Haven. Welcome to Law, Life, and Culture, Professor Lamar.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I read New Haven Independent coverage in 2018 by Paul Bass on Professor Lamar and her students' successes in compelling the town of Branford, to allow the development of the Parkside Village Affordable Housing Project. Currently, the town has requested a writ of certiorari to appeal the case, so that matter is still pending. But more recently, in September 2020, also in the New Haven Independent, Tom Breen reported how Professor Lamar is now involved in a case requesting that the town of Woodbridge change zoning policies to allow for a small multifamily structure with both market rate and affordable housing. Professor Lamar, can you tell us a bit about the Woodbridge case and how it speaks to larger issues in communities across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the two cases that you mentioned are different, but tell a story. So I'll actually just say that, as you noted, we've been working in Branford for a number of years. We have twice prevailed in court. We've secured various necessary local approvals. And despite those facts, even as you and I speak, elderly and disabled residents of the existing Parkside 1, because there is an existing development, are living in tiny studio apartments constructed prior to passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are still fighting day in and day out to redevelop the housing that they live in, to make it work better for them and to expand a 50-unit development to 67 units to serve even more people. Day in and day out, various local politicians and naysayers continue to try to use Parkside to advance their own political agendas and careers. We've seen tireless volunteers accused of, profiteering off of affordable housing development. It's something you hear a lot, which is, real estate development, developers must be making a lot of money. And the fact is, in these cases, oftentimes they don't, and for reasons we'll talk about. We've seen repeated unfounded allegations about how zoning works, about who lives in affordable housing, who deserves housing, and the like. And it's completely confounding the amount of time and money that various town officials seem to be willing to spend fighting 67 units of affordable housing on a site where there are already 50 units of housing in a residential neighborhood, next to a park, next to baseball fields, next to a preschool, next to a school, place where affordable housing makes a lot of sense. And my client has been fighting for years. The clinic has been fighting alongside them for the last 4 years, I think, to try to build this thing. And the reason why I think these two episodes together tell a story is because it explains a little bit of why we're doing what we're doing in Woodbridge. So in Branford, this is a years-long battle to build one development, and it's actually a redevelopment of an existing development. In Woodbridge, we're seeking a town-wide rezoning that would enable not just my client, the Open Communities Trust and the Open Communities Alliance, to develop what they have illustratively provided to the town as an example of what you could do if they adopted our rezoning, is a 4-unit structure that otherwise meets the zoning requirements in that zone. So in other words, it's no taller, no larger. It meets all of the public health code requirements, parking, all of the other requirements that apply, this development would meet. The only thing is it would be a multifamily development instead of a single family development, which allows you to do both subsidized affordability as well as what we call naturally occurring affordability, housing that's just more affordable because you don't require people to purchase 2 acres of land in order to build a single family house.
Okay.
So that's an example of what somebody could do, but what we're seeking in Woodbridge is relief that would allow anybody to do that on any parcel in town, that you could build a small multifamily structure where today you can only build a single family structure. And the Branford story tells you a little bit about why that's necessary, because if you force every individual development to go through a multi-year, emotionally trying process, marked by sort of lies and accusations and angry neighbors and being yelled at in public hearings, having your phone pushed out of your hands, as I've seen, being physically accosted by angry neighbors. If you have to do that every time you're looking to build affordable housing, you can see why it would be hard to build affordable housing. And when you make it hard to create a thing, that thing becomes expensive. And that kind of explains the landscape we live in right now, where we've made it incredibly hard to build housing. And as a result, housing is remarkably expensive.
Okay. Now, multiple organizations, including Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Brookings Institute, have reported that the country is experiencing a critical affordable housing shortage. Are you working to get workforce housing geographically spread across a wider swath of communities? And if so, can you address the larger social impact that that could have?
Yeah, so my personal motto is more housing everywhere. We have built woefully few new units of housing in the most economically vibrant parts of the country over the last 50 years. There's lots of reasons for that, but it's not good, it's bad. And when you fail to create new housing, you inflate the cost of existing housing, and you end up permitting really nefarious, as you referenced, social impacts, because you tie up into housing costs everything else that we think about when you kind of hear the old realtors adage, location, location, location. So you make it impossible when you tie up into housing costs, access to school quality, access to jobs, access to parks and safe neighborhoods, and you basically make it harder for people to climb the economic ladder because they can't access the same kinds of public resources that you need in order to be able to do that. So I am a fan of more housing everywhere because we haven't built nearly enough housing to keep up with demand. And to the extent that we have built housing, we've concentrated particular kinds of housing in particular places in a way that's sort of unfair to low and moderate income families who are trying to climb that socioeconomic ladder. So I want to disrupt that nexus between housing cost and access to all of these other kinds of public resources. And the only way to do that is to bring down those housing costs really everywhere.
Okay. And it's so interesting to me how much real estate housing can involve social issues and civil rights. When I was in law school, the ACLU, or National Lawyers Guild, seemed to be the only options students interested in civil rights were able to pursue. But today there's a greater public awareness, and I think some of that was driven by the Black Lives Matter movement, but there's a greater acknowledgement of the need to redress the pervasive historical wrongs that continue to have legacy effects in our society. Now, more people know about how the US government with banks redlined neighborhoods where residents were predominantly Black. They marked these areas of red as risky and unfit for investment, so people of color were denied loans to invest or repair homes. And even the GI Bill that provided low interest mortgage loans to returning World War II soldiers and boosted economic prosperity for many Americans discriminated against and excluded Black veterans. And then these demographic and economic discrepancies continued to be exacerbated with white flight to the suburbs in the mid 20th century. Do you think that real estate law and economic development is another form of working to further civil rights? And you can please amplify on my connection of civil rights to real estate law.
Yeah, so it is certainly the case that housing law is tainted or worse with the history of racism in this country. Housing's not the only thing. I mean, the reason we call it systemic racism is because the racism lives in all of the systems that affect our daily lives, whether it's education or healthcare or policing, and yes, housing. Now, housing's kind of unique, I guess, because it ties to all of the other systems so cleanly. Where you live is a determinant of health. Where you live is a determinant of what kind of policing you're subjected to. Where you live functions to limit or enhance your access to jobs. Where you live determines where your kids go to school. So housing ties into all the other things, but it's not the only thing that has been structured by a history and contemporary story of American racism. It just happens to tie into all these other things. And all of the things that you described are true. I mean, there's more. There remains racism in American housing markets today. Long Island Newsday, I worked from my old, where I grew up on Long Island, did a remarkable piece of investigative journalism last year on realtors today and racial steering on Long Island, and the degree to which today real estate agents will meet a Black family with strong credit and ability to purchase a house, and will steer them to particular neighborhoods, and will say when they don't think anybody's listening, although in this case, thanks to Newsday, people were listening, that, oh, I'm not going to show them, I'm not going to show them a house in a white neighborhood. Why would I do that? That still happens today. Banks treat Black and Latinx families coming into a branch asking about mortgages differently than they treat white families. And again, we have the benefit of knowing about that today, thanks to fair housing organizations like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center that do testing and will deploy actors and the like with armed with identical credit information and income information and wealth information, and find out that they're treated very differently by all of these different actors inside of the housing industry, and that it makes a big difference. That's all in addition to the fact that we, as a result of all of this discrimination over time, have a massive racial wealth gap in this country, with, depending on which study you look at, it doesn't matter which study you look at, there's a massive racial wealth gap, but depending, the numbers kind of depend on the study, but you have African-American families with an average household wealth of close to zero or in the low thousands, like 4-digit numbers, and white households where the average household wealth is upwards of $100,000. And when you think about what it costs to put in the down payment on a house, and you can very clearly see because housing costs have gotten so inflated, increasingly parental gifts are the primary mechanism by which many families put the down payment on their first house. And that's obviously not going to work if your parents can't write you a check for a down payment for your house. So this isn't just historic, it's not just stuff that happened in the 50s, it's through today, and it remains the case. So can you advance civil rights by working in real estate law and economic development? yes, for sure, because we have so much work to do. I don't think it's specific to housing. I mean, I think all of these systems, healthcare, criminal justice, healthcare, I said that, environmental law, all of these systems where we have perpetuated discrimination and segregation over the years are long overdue for remedying.
So getting to the nitty-gritty of some of your work, Yale Law School states your clinic provides transactional legal services to organizations seeking to advance economic opportunities. Can you provide a description of some of the transactional legal services, what the students in your clinic do?
Sure. Yeah. So for non-lawyers, or like, what the heck is transactional legal services? Transactional is just a sort of all-encompassing term for the kinds of lawyering we use to do deals. So, if litigation typically happens when people who don't want to deal with one another are forced into a courtroom with one another, transactions in theory are what happens when people who do want to do something together come together to do something that they want to do. And then there are lawyers involved in making sure that what they want to do happens the way that they want it to happen. So contracts and purchase agreements and leases, employment agreements. There's a real range to what we do. Transactional lawyering is sometimes is over-inclusively thought to be everything that's not litigation, and that's not really true, but it's kind of true. We take a broad approach to it. So our clients are all small businesses, nonprofits, sometimes for-profits, farms, farmers markets, affordable housing advocates, fair housing advocates, affordable housing developers. I'm really interested in working with anybody who is seeking to advance economic opportunity, broadly speaking. So the thing that shows up in the pages of The Independent and elsewhere more often than not is the fair housing work, but it's just one piece of what we do. We represent any number of New Haven nonprofits and organizations elsewhere in the state. We also do a little bit of work out of state, particularly around sort of civil rights issues. And the nature of the work that we do for our clients, again, is a lot of contract drafting, a lot of advising around nonprofit law, Section 501c3, and some of the other adjacent sections of the Internal Revenue Code, and what that means for what nonprofits can do or can't do in pursuit of their charitable missions. Increasingly, nonprofits are looking to produce some kind of revenue in an effort to be sustainable and innovative, and oftentimes we're doing work around that. To what degree can you engage in revenue producing activities as a nonprofit and still maintain your charitable status, that kind of thing.
Okay. Now, Merriam-Webster's defines gentrification as a process in which a poor area of a city experiences an influx of middle-class or wealthy people who renovate and rebuild homes and businesses, which often results in an increase in property values and the displacement of earlier, usually poorer residents. Do you agree with that definition, or does gentrification need to be defined by each local community? Would you define gentrification in New Haven, for example, as different from just, say, in New York City?
Mm-hmm. So the definition on its face seems sort of non-controversial. Like, I don't necessarily take issue with it. I don't take issue with the definition. I think the place where people butt heads, even inside of the housing advocacy community, is on what sparks this process, what causes this process. Why is it that one day middle class and well-off people are interested in moving to a neighborhood that they did not appear to be interested in moving to earlier? And I think that's where you kind of see that's where you see discord and disagreement about what the right policy solutions are to problems that I think most people agree would be problems. So involuntary displacement, when somebody is forced to leave a neighborhood that they don't really want to leave, that has all kinds of nefarious effects. That's bad. Voluntary displacement, something, I don't think you'd even call it displacement, voluntary, like moving is fine, but being forced to move can be really bad. It can lead to housing instability. It can lead to disrupting the kinds of social networks that people need in order to live their lives the way they live their lives, and proximity to a grandparent who watches your children, or friends and family who do the same, proximity to doctor's offices and other resources that people use on a regular basis, accessibility to your job. I mean, so involuntary displacement can be very, very bad. So when gentrification leads to displacement, I think everybody agrees that that's not good. I think the where you have discord is around what causes these things, and I think that's a that turns out to be a puzzle. It doesn't have a totally straightforward answer as to what causes gentrification and displacement.
So how would you distinguish gentrification from community and economic development?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, community economic development is sort of short-term I think the reason why you're asking the question is because a lot of CED work centers around bringing resources and amenities to low-income neighborhoods and making sure that people who live in low-income neighborhoods have access to all of the things that we talked about earlier that you need in order to live a happy life, right? And a textbook example of that is my clinic's client, the Greater Dwight Development Corporation, which is a community development corporation located in the Dwight neighborhood, founded in the early 1990s. At the time of its founding, the neighborhood residents who founded it really identified two primary needs in their neighborhood. One, the neighborhood was a food desert, and two, there was a need and remains a need citywide and really nationwide for high quality early childhood care. So they addressed that by bringing a full service grocery store to their neighborhood, which still exists to this day, the Stop and Shop at Dwight Plaza on Whaley Avenue, and by founding a daycare program, a Montessori daycare program. The worry becomes, it wasn't really a worry back then. It isn't, there isn't a lot of textbook gentrification in the city of New Haven. We can sort of have that argument back and forth with various people, and I'm sure many people would, it's a little bit of a tired argument, but the sort of studies don't show a whole lot of gentrification in here, but the worry would be that at the same time that you're addressing neighborhood need by bringing, for example, a grocery store to this food desert, that you're also opening the door to gentrification, because now that you have this neighborhood amenity that was missing, the neighborhood becomes more attractive to middle income and wealthy people. And that's a real worry. So it is very hard to find, studies that show that building new housing leads to gentrification, particularly when that housing is located, as it has oftentimes been in New Haven, on old parking lots and the like. But it is certainly the case that if you make a neighborhood nicer with grocery stores and parks and cultural amenities and cleaner streets and bringing down crime, that definitely can lead to gentrification. Like if you make a neighborhood nicer, then yes, you've made a neighborhood nicer, and people might be willing to spend more to live there. And in doing so, they might price out people who currently live there who can't afford to keep up. That's a real worry. So it's got to be a worry for community development practitioners like myself. I think it's misunderstood and underappreciated the degree to which the non-housing stuff that we do, the parks and the farmers markets and the grocery stores and the daycares, are much more likely to lead to gentrification than any of the housing stuff that we do.
Oh, that's interesting. But I think the work that you do can be tough, as it seems it could get challenged from different angles. You know, on one hand, cases with the Woodbridge fact pattern and strike me as having the classic NIMBY, not in my backyard issues. And that's sort of a reverse gentrification argument. I don't want my property values to go down. And this differs from perhaps other cases that have the gentrification concern of, oh, now my neighborhood properties values have gone up so much I can't afford to live here. Which of these scenarios pose the more difficult challenges?
I mean, I think it's all complicated and requires a certain degree of sensitivity, but I take as my guiding light, equity, the concept of equity, and then the concept of options. So if we happen to live in a state where, as a function of the way our government is structured, we have 169 towns, only 3.5 million people, and it's our kind of metro areas and job centers are carved up into tiny, tiny little governance structures that oftentimes function more like homeowners associations than they do like local governments. And the upshot is that we have intense socioeconomic and racial segregation across town lines. And people basically have the option in Connecticut of choosing to spend their property tax dollars on what are in effect private schools in high income suburbs. And in fact, there's a study from Brookings, I don't know, maybe it's about 8 years old now, that draws some of these connections between housing, schooling, and zoning, and finds that in Fairfield County, the schools with the top 20% of test scores cost per year, I want to get this right, I think it's $35,000 per year in housing costs, in additional housing costs, more than living in a district with a school in the bottom 20% of test scores. In New Haven County, it's not quite as bad, but it's still like $13,000 a year. So effectively, we're requiring people to pay in their mortgages and their property taxes to access the highest performing schools. This doesn't, I mean, this can't work. This is how you get to sort of a caste society and a class segregation system when you make it impossible for low-income children to access the resources that allow them to climb the socioeconomic ladder. So again, like, what are my guiding lights? Equity and options. I think people should have the options of mobility if they want it, and not have to use that option if they don't want it, because the place where they want to live, whether it's New Hallville or the Hill or Fairhaven, or you know, any other place in Connecticut, has the resources that they need to thrive. So that's kind of those two things: equity, options, and I guess the third thing, which really is the first thing, is whatever our clients tell us to do, because ultimately this is a legal clinic and we represent clients, and our clients decide, you know, what it is that they think their neighborhood would make their neighborhoods more thriving places, or what it is that they think needs to happen in order to make Connecticut a more equitable place.
Can both NIMBY arguments and fear of gentrification driving out long-term residents stem from a legitimate desire to preserve a neighborhood? So playing the devil's advocate, with NIMBYism first, just say many people's desire is not to exclude people based on race. And their argument is, look, the bulk of my savings is in my home. And it's not intentionally a racial issue, but more about the type of properties, multifamily rentals on the block, that could affect property values in my neighborhood and the larger community if the zoning allows for many similar developments to spring up. What's your response?
Yeah, so there's both a micro level response to the person saying that and the macro level response to the policies that have led us to where we are. So the micro level response to the person saying that is, the studies in the social science are pretty clear that multifamily housing doesn't bring down the price of nearby single family housing. That just turns out not to be true. So I think we've got to take that seriously to the extent that it's just not true. You know, I like to think in a place like Woodbridge, for example, which has a highly educated population of many people who choose to live there because of the schools, will stop and think before they make statements that are demonstrably false. So we'll see what happens, but I like to think that the very well-educated people of a town that, by all accounts, prioritizes education will not show up to land use hearings saying things that are, for which there is no support, like this is going to bring down my housing values, because again, there's no support for that statement. So on the micro level, I think that's an answer. On the macro level, yes, this is a thing that people say all the time, that affordable housing is going to bring down my property values, multifamily housing is going to bring down my property values, and my single largest asset by far, maybe I have no other assets whatsoever, is my house. So please don't do this to me. And there is an economist at Dartmouth, Bill Fischel, who has theorized that the reason exclusionary zoning happens when it does, which is basically beginning in the 70s, is because of inflation. And it's only with the inflation of the 1970s that people's houses become such an important asset in their portfolio, and people become very risk averse. And even if they end up making stupid choices as a result of that risk aversion, that's what's happening, is they're risk averse. So there's another thing that happens in 1970 that's worth noting, even before, which is that the Fair Housing Act passes in 1968. So a lot of people in 1968, in theory anyway, lose the ability to expressly racist, to explicitly be racist in their choices in terms of housing. And so it would make sense that at the same time you would try to find sort of quieter versions of things that might have racist impacts, and exclusionary zoning happens, right? Is birthed, basically happens in this era. In a massive way. I mean, exclusionary zoning exists before that. Woodbridge, for example, adopts its highly exclusionary zoning ordinance in the 30s. But in terms of this becoming widespread everywhere phenomenon, this happens in the 60s, 70s. So it is, on that macro question, it just turns out to be, I think, pretty bad policy that we've put people in a situation where they have a single asset that makes them highly risk averse when it comes to that asset. I think most housing scholars and advocates would undo the housing policies of 100 years ago, subsidized 30-year-long mortgages, for example. Exclusionary zoning is one of them. These policies that have kind of put home ownership on a pedestal and made housing more of a sort of financial vehicle than a commodity.
I understand also there's some resistance against developing Grand Avenue, Whaley Avenue, and Dixwell Avenue into commercial corridors. The New Haven Commercial Corridors website explains that the city wants to make these areas more sustainable, affordable, and walkable. Paul Bass had reported that the plan is to make it easier for local small investors and others looking to build new housing and stores and other businesses to take root in those areas. He also reported anti-gentrification groups have opposed the corridor plan, wanting more public input and more affordable units, a minimum of 25% in any market rate apartment with over 9 units. And you had voiced concern that these groups may actually end up creating a situation where only deep pocket developers then get to be the ones constructing projects and build only market rate housing. Can you explain how that could happen?
Yeah, so I mean, simply put, when you make it hard to create a thing, you make that thing expensive, right? So you make it really hard to build housing or retail space or what have you, then you're going to make that thing really expensive. So, you know, again, like guiding lights of equity and options and what my clients want. So, you know, Grand Avenue and Dixwell Avenue, Whaley Avenue are already major commercial core. I mean, these are commercial thoroughfares. There are parts of Dixwell Avenue that are more residential than others, but the, you know, I think that what the city was trying to do was to make it more feasible to redevelop some of the existing buildings without running into, for example, enormous parking requirements, which is something we've certainly seen with clients that are looking to develop on Whaley Avenue, that prior to the passage of the commercial corridor rezoning, which did happen on Whaley Avenue back in February, I guess, of 2020, maybe January. Any kind of new development on the corridor required massive amounts of parking, for example. And that's a problem for a lot of reasons, one of which was cost to the developer of purchasing land necessary to create that parking, but other problems of sustainability and walkability and what kind of city do we want to live in. You know, lots of problems that were not specific necessarily to a given developer, but really all of us who may not want, you know, to be walking down a commercial street in our neighborhood and have to walk by like enormous parking lots. You know, I think that was my reaction to that rezoning, primarily driven by clients who are developing on Whaley Avenue. And I live in Worcester Square, just a few blocks from the Grand Avenue corridor, which is a little bit of a wasteland, honestly. It is underdeveloped. We are losing businesses in that corridor who have left, or who are like just barely in business and never open. So it is not an amenity to our neighborhood currently, the stretch of Grand Avenue that the city was seeking to rezone. There are some social services organizations that are located there, which is great. And I'm glad that they have their spaces there and that it works for them. I'm glad to live in a neighborhood that welcomes those kinds of social services providers to the neighborhood. But there are also significant stretches where there's just nothing. So it would be nice, it would be better if there were something, which I guess is another governing philosophy.
Well, we're happy that you're all in our virtual neighborhood here at WNHH 103.5 FM in New Haven, Connecticut. We are speaking with Yale Law School Associate Professor Anika Singh Lamar. She teaches at the school's Community and Economic Development Clinic, and I'm Betsy Kim. So Professor Lamar, you referenced gentrification that can happen outside of housing, but when areas are just made nicer with other amenities added, and then they become more expensive as a result. What are some safeguards that can be taken to prevent the unwanted effects of that, of then driving out the long-term residents?
Yeah, so there are really two things. There's two big categories of things that you can do to avoid housing prices escalating in a way that displaces people in a neighborhood. So one is what I call capital A affordability. So these are rules, restrictions that require landlords to charge only certain affordable rents. These are rent control, and then subsidies that allow the government to impose on a landlord what we call deed restrictions, which you file on the land records, and it'll say, for example, for the next 40 years, the landlord will charge no more than 30% of each tenant's income, and tenants are limited to people who make less than 60% of the area median income, let's say. So one thing you can do to make housing affordable is what I call this, again, this capital A affordability, force it. And that is, your community land trusts fall into that bucket too. Community land trusts are like this terminology that's become into vogue recently, but essentially is that deed restriction stuff that we've been doing for years in this country. And you can force it. you cannot, it is very hard to force it, particularly in a state like Connecticut, where local governments cannot on their own adopt rent control. We don't have local authority to adopt rent control. It would happen to happen at the state level. It's very hard to force it unless you have a lot of government dollars at play to deed restrict housing. So if you have many, many, many government dollars at play, you can buy up lots of housing and turn it into social housing or public housing, or you can give money to landlords and developers to help them, let's say, fix up a property in exchange for a deed restriction. So capital A affordability costs a lot of public dollars, except unless you can do rent control, which you can't do on the local level in Connecticut. The other big category is what I call lowercase a affordability, which a lot of people call naturally occurring affordable housing, which is essentially allow the market to build enough units that housing remains affordable because you don't inflate the cost by restricting supply. These approaches, it is important to note, are not mutually exclusive. And as you can probably tell from the fact that my sort of philosophy is more housing everywhere, is, you should do both. In Connecticut, which is in a perpetual state of fiscal crisis, it is very hard to do the former. The Malloy administration, our previous governor, put a ton of money into affordable housing construction, still not nearly enough given the size of the need. And we're unlikely to live through another, that's sort of pessimistic. It's unlikely that in the next 10 years, we're ever going to see that level of investment in affordable housing again, perpetual state of fiscal crisis. So we need to do both. You need to do both. You need to pursue the construction of lots of social housing and subsidies that result in permanently affordable or long-term affordable housing. And at the same time that you let the market build lots and lots of units in an effort to make sure you've got naturally occurring affordable housing too. It's important to note that in a place like Connecticut and New York and California, Massachusetts, and a lot of high cost places, our affordable housing crisis is not limited to poor people. So we don't have enough, we have poor families overpaying for housing, which is to say paying upwards of more than 30%, more than 50% oftentimes of their income goes to housing costs. But we have that true for moderate income, middle class households too. So much so that we actually spend government dollars on building middle income housing, and people react to that and say, that's crazy. Why are we subsidizing housing for middle class people? And the reason is because we've made it illegal for the market to provide housing to those people. The only way to deal with that problem is really just to let the market build a whole lot more housing.
Okay. Now, community development and economic investment excite me because I believe that these efforts can make cities more livable and enjoyable. At least pre-COVID, for the last decade, New York City seemed to revel in this unstoppable urban revitalization narrative. The New Yorkers love to contrast today's city to the 1975 Daily News front cover with a headline saying, "Forward to the city, drop dead," when the city initially was refused a federal bailout from its near bankruptcy. How do you explain how the urban revival of New York City occurred, and what about New Haven, as over the same time period, drastic improvements also occurred in New Haven as well? What role did community and economic development play for both of these cities?
Yeah, so I think Patrick Sharkey has a great book. He's a sociologist at, I think he's now at Princeton. He was at NYU when he wrote the book, and it's called An Uneasy Peace. And it's mostly about the way in which community organizations have contributed to decreases in crime through work that is not necessarily strictly about preventing crime, but because of the work that community development, community organizations do to create resources and amenities, therefore have this sort of carry-on effect of that helps to make neighborhoods safer and things like that. Which I think is sort of a really important piece of this of this conversation, I think community development and nonprofits have played an important role in the creation and maintenance of civic infrastructure. I don't think they're responsible for the kind of fundamental agglomeration economics and the kind of underlying desirability of cities. I think a lot of people have written about the importance of sort of concentrating resources and how economies have built, and in an increasingly knowledge-based economy, agglomerating those knowledge resources turns out to have economic impacts that would make it highly desirable for that kind of concentration to occur. That said, the kind of urban revival or whatever of the early 21st century it's not a given across the country. It hasn't happened everywhere. You've got legacy cities across the country that never really saw the benefits of that, where the agglomerations didn't work to their benefit, where the kind of M&A economy, the post-antitrust economy, where we allow kind of companies to be bought up and vacate their headquarters in, say, Milwaukee and concentrate it all in New York or Boston or whatever, really have worked to their detriment. So, we on the coast and like the sort of coastal land of the US have a view of this that's really skewed by where we live, and having a lens on New York, but not thinking very much about Akron. These aren't like hard and fast truths that apply to every city in the country, far from it.
And while I enjoy experiencing more livable, more vibrant neighborhoods, I think economic diversity is also an incredibly important piece of that. And that's why many cities, to me, are a bit more interesting than, at least stereotypically, the greater homogeneity associated with suburbs. Plus, I don't want to see people who earn lower wages getting driven further and further away from the urban cities where there are jobs. But is this honestly just an inevitable outcome, in part, when a neighborhood is revitalized? And with the shrinking government dollars now, what else could be done to preserve a neighborhood's cultural mix and its diversity?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about housing. So I think it's important to remember that there are other things that make a neighborhood affordable and accessible, not just residential rents, but commercial rents. Is there a place where an immigrant grocery store or a first generation entrepreneur can start braiding or a boutique or a restaurant or lunch counter? Is it possible for the people who live here to start things that result in that kind of vitality that you're describing? Oftentimes, allowing those things requires us to be kind of open to the idea of change, and open to the idea that places do change. It also, I think, requires us to think really hard about what the barriers to entry are. What makes it hard for people who don't have a lot of resources to start things? How can we make that easier? And I think we're seeing efforts along those lines in lots of places, including here in New Haven, around city seeds efforts to spark small food businesses. Similarly with Collab, which is a local nonprofit. Do your rules make it possible for food trucks to open on every corner? This is a debate New Haven had a few years ago. I think we could go back and forth probably for a whole nother hour session about whether it worked and if it did and what it could have done better, and why it is that people in City Hall feel the need to micromanage where food trucks go, just to give people a little bit of a sense of how I feel about this. What are the things we do that make it possible and plausible, not just for people to live in a place, but to contribute to that place and sort of give it their all in terms of what they have to offer to a local artistic scene, business scene, whatever it is, food scene.
Now, people in the real estate industry have often said, it's not us, it's the employers who need to pay people wages where they can live in areas and get to work. So in figuring out this affordable housing puzzle, do you think issues such as minimum wage of just say $15 an hour or other facts surrounding the growing income gap need to be addressed?
Yeah, for sure. But it's also, I mean, yes, period. Also, housing costs have risen faster than other costs have for all the reasons that we kind of talked about earlier. So I don't think it's enough. And in fact, this sort of mirrors something that we saw in public comments that were made in Woodbridge during, I think, their last, let me get it wrong, but their last sort of comprehensive planning exercise, where somebody said something like this: oh, it's not that housing costs in Woodbridge are too high. It's, I'm going to get the exact words wrong. It was something like, people who make money can afford to live here, was essentially what they said. It was like, well, okay, but that can't be how we govern, by saying, people who make money can afford good schools. People who make money can afford safe neighborhoods and, paved streets. People who make money, that's no way to run a country. So yes, we need to do something about the sort of yawning gap between CEO wages and factory worker, warehouse worker, more likely these days, wages. That's a problem, but it's not a problem that excuses our messed up housing policy.
Well, this hour has just flown by, and now we only have just one more minute. I've enjoyed talking to you so much that I think I unfortunately have to just ask you one last question.
Okay.
With the vaccine coming and COVID-19, it can't keep people away from cities forever, but at the same time, government funding will have a lot of competing demands. What do you forecast for community development and economic development? And you can include what your clinic has around the corner and in the horizon.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say the two things that we really focused on this last semester that I had not focused on previously are health equity, and which I think is at the front of everyone's minds these days. We also have done a lot more small business work over the last 9 months since the middle of March, just helping as many New Haven small businesses as we can find us, access government support, whether it's paycheck protection or other programs, highly flawed programs, but to the extent that we could help people navigate them, we tried. And more generally, outside of government subsidies, trying to assist local small businesses. And I think those are both things that we're going to continue to do through the remainder of this pandemic and post-pandemic.
Well, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And we have really appreciated having this opportunity to speak with you about community development and its impacts on our lives and culture on WNHH 103.5 FM's Law, Life, and Culture. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. I'm Betsy Kim.